Welcome to St James Conversation for the first Sunday in Lent. Today I'm going to talk about our reading from the first letter of Peter, chapter 3, verses 18 to 22. Stories from Malawi and Uganda shared with us this week have left me feeling somewhat overwhelmed. The suffering of people there is immense. It's hard to know what we can do about it besides offering donations and our prayers. But perhaps that's exactly what to do. We live in relative comfort with the security that comes from being citizens of a wealthy nation, which can afford to support us, treat us and vaccinate us. How different would it be if we lived in sub-Saharan Africa, where such security is merely a dream? Having said this, we know that people all over the world and all over our country are facing poverty, suffering and death. When we face the death of a loved one who has led a long, fulfilling life, it's perhaps easier to take. Death comes to us all, and when it's timely, it is acceptable somehow. But for those who have lost loved ones who are younger, whose lives were cut short when they were in full bloom, the grief and suffering is much harder to bear. It seems so unfair, so tragic. Suffering is something most of us struggle with and find terribly hard. Suffering is closely linked with love and desire. It occurs when what and whom we love or want to have is taken away or denied us. We usually view suffering as a punishment. Why me? We're tempted to ask. What did I do to deserve this? We search for explanations, something to pin it on, someone to blame. It's not unusual for suffering to be accompanied by anger, guilt and shame. Peter, in his first epistle, counters the popular idea that suffering is punishment for sin or a sign of God's displeasure. In fact, he argues that the opposite is true. He points to the example of Jesus Christ, who travelled the path of suffering. After his baptism, Jesus suffered in the wilderness before embarking on his ministry. At his passion or suffering, Jesus suffered trial and death before entering into the blessing, triumph and glory of his resurrection. Christ is the righteous one mentioned in today's reading, who suffered for the unrighteous. Peter tells his readers that Christ died to bring each one of us to God. Suffering isn't something to be afraid of, because even in suffering, God's purposes are being worked out. Jesus' suffering in the wilderness brought insight that infused his teaching and his ministry. Jesus' passion and death freed people from sin and judgment and gave them salvation and access to God. Those who suffer for Christ do so in solidarity with Christians throughout the generations and throughout our world today who suffer for their faith. When I read this reading, I wondered why Noah features in it. Well, Noah symbolises God's grace. God, the one who is patient, the one who rescues in times of catastrophe, the one who sent his Son, the Beloved, to save humankind. In the story from Genesis, when the floods subsided, Noah and those with him entered a new world, cleansed from sin and prepared afresh for life. The water was both the means of destruction for the contemporaries and the means of deliverance into a fresh start for all who were in the ark. Baptism, similarly, is the way to pass from sin and judgment to deliverance into a new life. Jesus, by his death and resurrection, triumphed over all evil powers and ascended to God's right hand, where he rules with authority over all. Baptism is an appeal to God. It's the beginning of a person's journey to salvation. Baptism symbolises passing through tribulations, even death, to stand in the presence of God. By baptism, we appropriate the benefits of Christ's death and resurrection. We are united to Christ by faith and rescued from death by his resurrection. The appeal to Noah is intended as encouragement to persevere through suffering. Just as God protected Noah, so God, through Jesus Christ, saves people who are suffering today. All this serves to underline the debt of gratitude we owe Jesus. He was prepared to endure suffering and death for our sake, so that we have salvation, hope, and eternal life. One thing that we can do by way of thanks is to share the love of Christ with those who don't yet know him and give them hope. Be prepared to lift our neighbours out of despair by introducing them to Jesus Christ. Be willing to tell them about the one who can help them in their suffering and give them salvation and eternal life. To do this, we need to be both brave and prepared to appear foolish. Yet, love can make us courageous fools. Let me encourage you to use this season of Lent to remind yourself of all Jesus has done for you. Read the stories of Jesus' life in the Gospels. Watch the Chosen film and see him portrayed on screen. Spend time praying and enjoying his presence with you. Most of all, deepen your love for him and let his love for you sink in and let it fill you up to the point where it flows out of you, giving you the boldness to tell others about the hope that you have. Thanks to Jesus.